On the morning of October 3, 1985, a woman named Carol Gregory walked into a police station in Manchester, England, and told an officer that she believed she was losing her mind. She had been married for 11 years. She had 2 children. She had a job, a home, friends who liked her, a mother who loved her. And yet she sat across from that officer and described a version of her life that sounded, by every clinical definition, like someone in the early stages of a psychological break. She described forgetting entire conversations she'd had just days before. She described believing she had said things she hadn't said, done things she hadn't done, reacted in ways she couldn't account for. She described a creeping, spreading feeling that her own perception of reality could not be trusted. She told the officer she had come not to report a crime, but because she genuinely wasn't sure anymore whether her experiences were real. The officer took notes. He referred her to a mental health practitioner. Nobody at that stage looked at the husband. It would be 3 more years before a social worker named Patricia Henley reviewed Carol's case alongside 14 other women from the same district and noticed something the individual files had buried. Not one of these women was losing her mind. Every single one of them had a partner who was systematically, deliberately, and methodically destroying her ability to trust her own perception of reality. What Carol Gregory and those 14 women were experiencing had a name, and that name, along with the psychological mechanism behind it, is something that millions of people are living inside right now. Inside marriages, inside workplaces, inside families, inside friendships, without any idea that what they are experiencing is not a personal failing. It is a tactic, it is deliberate, and it has a documented, traceable, and deeply disturbing history that most people have never truly been told. Understanding what it is, how it works, and, most importantly, how to recognize it when it is happening to you is what you will walk away from this able to do. Not in vague terms, not in the form of general advice about trusting yourself. In concrete, specific, observable terms that will change the way you read the behavior of people around you. That is a promise, and it is the only reason this is worth your time. This is what we investigate at Mind Cage, the mechanisms beneath human behavior that most people never see, precisely because those mechanisms are designed not to be seen. The word gaslighting is used so frequently now that it has become almost meaningless in casual conversation. People use it to describe any situation in which someone disagrees with them, any moment in which they feel dismissed, any exchange in which their feelings are not immediately validated. That is not what this is about. What this is about is something far more specific, far more calculated, and far more dangerous than a disagreement or a dismissal. What this is about is the deliberate, sustained manipulation of another person's relationship with reality itself, and the documented psychological damage that follows when it succeeds. The term comes from a 1938 stage play written by Patrick Hamilton, a British playwright whose personal life was defined by alcoholism and a tortured relationship with a woman named Gertrude Bone. The play was called Gaslight. It later became a film in 1944, directed by George Cukor and starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. The central premise was this: a husband, attempting to conceal a murder he had committed in the upper floors of their shared home, begins dimming the gaslights in the house to search for hidden jewels. His wife notices the lights dimming. He tells her the lights are not dimming. He tells her she is imagining it. When she describes other strange occurrences, sounds from above, objects that seem to move, he tells her, calmly and consistently, that she is confused, that she is unwell, that her memory has always been unreliable. Over time and under the sustained pressure of his denial, she begins to believe him. She begins to believe that the problem is inside her head, What Hamilton captured in that play, and what clinical researchers would not formally articulate for another 4 decades, is one of the most psychologically precise mechanisms of control ever documented. The husband in that story was not simply lying, he was engineering his wife's reality. He was constructing, deliberately and methodically, a version of the world in which her perception was the variable that couldn't be trusted, not his behavior, her perception. That distinction is everything. The clinical study of this behavior as a distinct psychological pattern did not begin in earnest until the 1970s, and even then it emerged not from psychology, but from sociology. It was the work of researchers studying coercive control in domestic relationships, people like Evan Stark, a forensic social worker and researcher who would spend decades documenting the ways in which abuse in intimate partnerships was not primarily physical but strategic. Stark published his landmark study, Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, in 2007, but the fieldwork behind it stretched back 30 years. What he found again and again was that the most damaging form of abuse left no physical marks. It was invisible. It operated on the level of perception, of memory, of the victim's internal sense of what was real. The psychiatrist Judith Herman, whose 1992 work, Trauma and Recovery, became one of the foundational texts of trauma studies, described a pattern she called reality distortion, in which an abuser systematically undermines a victim's confidence in their own cognition. Herman noted that this form of manipulation was not incidental to abuse. It was often central to it, because a victim who does not trust their own perception cannot effectively report what is being done to them, cannot effectively seek help, and cannot effectively leave. The destruction of self-trust was not a side effect of the abuse. In many cases it was the primary objective. But here is the moment in this history that most people never hear about, and it is the moment that reveals just how calculated this behavior can be. In 1981, a British psychiatrist named G.H. Gulsay published a case study in the journal Psychiatric Annals describing a patient, a woman in her mid-40s, who had been admitted for what her husband described as a progressive delusional disorder. She believed, her husband told the admitting physician, that people were watching her. She believed conversations were being altered. She believed objects in her home were being moved. The husband was distraught, cooperative, articulate. He brought documentation. He brought letters she had written that appeared confused and paranoid. He sat with the psychiatrist for 40 minutes and painted with careful, gentle concern the portrait of a woman whose grip on reality had been deteriorating for years. She was admitted. She was medicated. She was kept under observation. And then, 6 weeks into her admission, a social worker discovered that the husband had been for several years having an affair. He had been reading her private journal. He had been destroying correspondence she received. He had been convincing her that conversations she clearly remembered had not occurred. The letters he had brought as evidence of her paranoia, he had written them himself, forged in her handwriting, and introduced them into her files. The woman was not delusional. She was, in every meaningful sense, correct. She had been watched. Conversations had been altered. Objects had been moved. And then, when her appropriate responses to those real events had become visible, she had been institutionalized for them. Guthau called it, in his case notes, induced psychosis by proxy, though that term never gained clinical traction. What it described was not a disorder, it was a crime. It was a man using the machinery of medicine itself as a weapon of control. That case is not unique. It is not an outlier. Researchers who have studied coercive control in intimate relationships find this pattern, the escalation from private manipulation to the recruitment of external institutions in the service of that manipulation, documented across cultures, across socio-economic groups, across educational levels. The sophistication of the method varies. The method itself does not. Now consider what you know about the relationships in your own life. Think about a time when someone told you that you had said something you had no memory of saying. Think about a time when you were told that your emotional response to a situation was out of proportion. Not gently, not once, but consistently, persistently, as a refrain. Think about a time when you found yourself in an argument, and somewhere in the middle of it you lost the thread of what you had actually experienced and began arguing about what you might have experienced, what you possibly could have misunderstood, what your history of getting things wrong might suggest about your interpretation of this particular moment. If any of that feels familiar, keep listening, because the pattern we are about to go through in detail is the same pattern whether it occurs in a marriage, in a workplace, or in a family, and the mechanics of how it works will be recognizable once you know where to look. In 1993, a woman named Susan Forward, a licensed therapist who had spent nearly 20 years working with survivors of emotional abuse, published a book called Emotional Blackmail. It was not specifically about gaslighting, but it documented a behavior pattern she called FOG, an acronym for fear, obligation, and guilt, as the emotional landscape in which manipulative behavior most reliably operates. What Forward had observed across hundreds of clinical cases was that effective manipulation does not work by forcing a change in another person's behavior. It works by corrupting a person's relationship with their own interior experience. You cannot control a person who trusts their own feelings. You can control a person who has been taught to doubt them. That insight which Forward reached through clinical practice and which Evan Stark and Judith Herman reached through research would later be formalized in a different context by social psychologists studying influence and persuasion more broadly. Leon Festinger's earlier work on cognitive dissonance, published in 1957, provided the theoretical scaffolding. Human beings experience acute psychological discomfort when they hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. We are, by our nature, motivated to resolve that discomfort, and the person who can engineer that contradiction, who can make you simultaneously experience something as real and be told it is not real, has access to a powerful engine of psychological destabilization. The gaslighter does not have to win every argument. The gaslighter only has to introduce enough doubt that the target begins to spend more cognitive and emotional energy managing their own uncertainty than they do attending to what is actually happening. That is a subtle distinction, and it is absolutely critical. Say it again, the goal is not to win. The goal is to make you uncertain, because a person who is uncertain is manageable. A person who trusts their own perception is not. We need to spend a significant amount of time with a specific, real, documented case, not because it is the most dramatic example, but because it is among the most thoroughly studied, and because the way it unfolded tracks almost exactly with the clinical literature in a way that makes the pattern visible stage by stage. The case of Elizabeth Morgan began in 1985 in Washington, D.C. Morgan was a plastic surgeon, educated at Harvard and Oxford, a woman of exceptional intelligence and professional accomplishment. She had a daughter, Hillary, from a relationship with a man named Eric Foritich, an oral surgeon. The custody dispute that would follow became one of the most documented cases in the history of American family law. It consumed 7 years, multiple congressional hearings, and resulted in legislation that bears Morgan's name. But the element of it most relevant here is not the legal outcome. It is the psychological architecture of how Morgan's credibility was systematically dismantled. Morgan began, in 1986, telling courts, therapists, and family members that her daughter was being sexually abused during visitation with Foritich. She had physical evidence. She had testimony from clinical professionals who had examined the child. She had her own observations, documented in contemporaneous notes, of behavioral changes in her daughter consistent with the literature on child sexual trauma. She was a physician. She was articulate. Her concern was coherent and documented. And yet, over the following 3 years, what happened to her public and legal identity was a masterclass in the destruction of credibility. It began with the characterization of her emotional state. Attorneys representing Foretich consistently described Morgan's concerns not as the conclusions of a trained medical professional examining physical evidence, but as the projections of a disturbed and obsessive woman. The word paranoid appeared in filings. The phrase irrational fixation appeared in court records. The narrative being constructed was not that Morgan was wrong in her assessment. It was that Morgan was the kind of person whose assessments could not be trusted. The target was not her evidence. The target was her perception. When Morgan continued to press her concerns, the tactics escalated. Her professional judgment was called into question in contexts unrelated to the case. Her fitness as a mother was challenged. Her mental health was scrutinized. A pattern emerged in which any action Morgan took to defend or document her position was reframed as evidence of her instability. She fought back, and that was proof of her obsession. She sought additional professional opinions, and that was proof of her paranoia. She documented her concerns meticulously, and that was proof of her manipulation. Every piece of behavior that a rational person engaged in a legitimate dispute might exhibit was retrofitted into a portrait of a woman who had lost contact with reality. Here is the element that makes this case so instructive. Morgan was not alone. She had professionals on her side, she had documentation, she had clinical support. And still by the late 1980s, the public perception of Elizabeth Morgan, in media coverage, in court documents, in the social environment around her, had been sufficiently corrupted that she was jailed for civil contempt for refusing to disclose her daughter's location, a contempt that continued for 25 months, the longest such imprisonment in American legal history at that time. 25 months in jail. Not because her concerns were found to be fabricated, not because she was found to be lying, but because the sustained systematic attack on her credibility had made her position, and by extension her perception, the thing that was on trial, rather than the behavior she was documenting. The congressional legislation that eventually freed her was passed in 1989. It was called the Elizabeth Morgan Act. But here is what the law could not undo, and what clinical researcher Jennifer Freyd at the University of Oregon would later address in her 1996 theory of betrayal trauma. The psychological impact of sustained reality distortion does not end when the distortion stops. The damage to a person's relationship with their own perception, the habituated self-doubt, the internalized question, "Am I the problem here?" persists long after the external source of that doubt has been removed. Freyd's betrayal trauma theory proposed that when a trusted person or institution becomes a source of harm, the victim often unconsciously suppresses awareness of that betrayal as a survival mechanism, particularly when they are in a position of dependence on the betrayer. What this means in practical terms is that gaslighting is most effective and most damaging when it comes from someone the target depends on, a partner, a parent, an employer, a caregiver. The dependency creates a situation in which believing the gaslighter is, at some level, safer than believing yourself. Because if you believe yourself, you have to confront the fact that someone you depend on is harming you. And that confrontation carries consequences, financial, social, emotional, that the mind would rather not face. This is where the first deep pattern becomes clear. Gaslighting is not random in its targeting. It is situational. It operates most powerfully in relationships defined by unequal power, unequal dependency, or both. The boss who controls your employment, the boss who controls your employment, the parent whose approval you have sought since childhood, the partner who controls the finances, the housing, the social network, the person who is doing this to you, whether consciously or in the more troubling cases semi-consciously, is doing it from a position in which your dependency is the fuel for the tactic. When researchers analyzed case studies of documented gaslighting across clinical settings, they found that the behavior follows a recognizable progression. It does not appear fully formed. It develops, it escalates, and it escalates in a particular direction toward the point at which the target is most isolated from sources of external reality checking. The first stage is what clinical psychologists have come to call the incident, a single, deniable event. You remember something. They say it didn't happen. You express something. They say you didn't say it that way. The incident is small enough that it can be attributed to an honest difference in perception. You might be wrong. They might be wrong. It resolves with you accepting, or at least considering, the possibility that your memory was faulty. This is critical. The first incident plants a seed of self-doubt. That seed is not catastrophic. In a healthy relationship between two honest people, occasional disagreements about memory are normal and benign. The difference is in what follows. In a pattern of gaslighting, what follows is escalation. The incidents become more frequent. The subject matter expands. It is no longer just a misremembered date or a misquoted sentence. It is your emotional state. You were not as upset as you say you were. It is your history. You have always had trouble with this. It is your judgment. You tend to overreact. The self-doubt that began as a localized response to a specific incident spreads into something systemic. You stop trusting your memory. You stop trusting your emotional responses. You begin, gradually and without recognizing what is happening, to outsource your relationship with reality to the person who has been consistently supplying you with an alternative version of it. What researchers notice next reveals something most people never see coming. The gaslighter does not have to be present for this stage to take effect. By the time a target has reached significant self-doubt, they have internalized the gaslighter's voice. They hear it themselves, preemptively, before the gaslighter has to use it. They begin to gaslight themselves. They dismiss their own perceptions before they can be dismissed by the other person. They explain away their own discomfort before they can be told it isn't real. The dependency is complete, not because the gaslighter is always there, but because the gaslighter is no longer needed to maintain it. This phenomenon, the internalization of the doubt-inducing voice, was documented extensively by psychologist Robin Stern in her 2007 book, The Gaslight Effect. Stern, working from clinical experience with hundreds of patients, described what she called the gaslight tango, the way in which targets often become active participants in their own reality distortion, not because they are weak or unintelligent, but because the human need for relational coherence is stronger than most people understand. We are built for connection. We will distort our own reality before we will accept that a person we love is fundamentally untrustworthy. Stern's work also identified something that the prior research had largely overlooked: the degree to which the targets of this behavior are often among the most psychologically sophisticated people in their environment. Not the most vulnerable in the sense of being fragile or naive, but the most invested in understanding. The person who keeps trying to work out what went wrong. The person who keeps re-examining the conversation to find where they misunderstood. The person who, when told they are too sensitive or too emotional or too reactive, takes that feedback seriously and attempts to correct for it. Intellectual seriousness, in the context of a gaslighting relationship, becomes a vector for the manipulation. The more carefully you analyze your own behavior, the more effectively the self-doubt is installed. If this is hitting close to home for you, it should. Because this is not a pattern confined to extreme cases. This is not something that happens only to people in obviously abusive situations. Research consistently finds that elements of this pattern exist across a wide spectrum of relationships, and that most people who are experiencing it are not experiencing it in the dramatic, definitive form that makes it recognizable from the outside. They are experiencing it in the quiet, incremental, invisible form that is by far the most common. If this kind of deep exploration of the human mind is what you're after, subscribing to Mind Cage means you never miss one of these investigations. Now we need to go somewhere that the popular conversation about this topic rarely goes: the workplace. The 2019 study, published in the Journal of Applied Psychology by researchers Lou Navis and Kessler, examined 149 employees across a range of industries and documented what they called supervisor gaslighting, a pattern of behavior in which managers used reality distortion as a control mechanism. The pattern they documented included claiming that conversations had not occurred, reframing an employee's competent performance as evidence of overconfidence, attributing the employee's documentation of instructions received to paranoia or CYA behavior, and, most commonly, creating an environment in which the employee's perception of workplace events could never be publicly trusted. The employees in these cases were not being abused in the way that phrase is typically understood. They were being managed, and managed in a way that made them easier to manage, because a person who does not trust their own professional judgment is a person who does not file complaints, does not raise concerns, does not push back on unreasonable demands. The financial incentive for this behavior in workplace settings is stark. An employee who has been convinced their perception is unreliable is less likely to pursue a legal remedy for genuine misconduct. They are more likely to absorb blame for failures that are systemic rather than individual. They are more likely to work harder in order to compensate for the perceived deficit in their own reliability. From a purely transactional standpoint, the manipulation pays. This brings us to something that research on coercive control has made increasingly clear, and that is deeply uncomfortable to sit with. Some of the people who engage in this behavior are not doing it consciously. They are not, in every case, calculating strategists who have chosen to undermine someone's reality as a deliberate tactic. Some of them have simply learned, in families, in earlier relationships, in environments that rewarded this kind of behavior, that destabilizing someone else's self-trust is an effective way to maintain dominance in a relationship. They have internalized it. They deploy it habitually, without full conscious awareness, as a default response to conflict, to challenge, to the threat of accountability. That does not make it less damaging to the person on the receiving end, but it does change the way we understand the phenomenon. And it has significant implications for what the patterns look like and how to recognize them. The habitual, semi-conscious form of gaslighting is often harder to identify than the deliberate kind, precisely because the person engaging in it is also, at some level, confused. They genuinely believe their version of events. They have, through years of practice, become so skilled at rewriting the internal record that they are not maintaining the fiction. They are living in it. When they tell you that you said something you didn't say, they believe it. When they tell you your emotional response is inappropriate, they believe it. Their certainty is real, and human beings are exquisitely calibrated to read certainty as evidence of truth. This is the mechanism that makes gaslighting so neurologically disorienting. When two people are in conflict and one of them is uncertain and the other is absolutely certain, the human brain, which is a social organ, profoundly attuned to consensus, experiences a strong pull toward the certain party. Certainty feels like evidence. Confidence reads as reliability. And so the person who is telling the truth but is shaken and uncertain loses credibility instinctively and automatically to the person who is lying but is calm and sure. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences have documented in neuroimaging studies that the social evaluation of credibility operates in the same brain regions associated with basic threat assessment. The brain does not process "this person is more confident" and "this person is more trustworthy" as separate propositions. It collapses them. It treats the confident voice as the safe voice, And in a context where one person has been systematically presenting an alternative version of reality with absolute consistency and calm, the target's brain has, at a biological level, been taught to treat that person's voice as more reliable than its own internal signals. This is not a metaphor. This is a neurological description of what sustained reality distortion does to a human brain. And this is precisely why the effects do not disappear when the relationship ends. The neural pathways that were built under the sustained influence of the gaslighter, the pathways that connect internal perception with unreliable, persist. The person who has spent years being told their emotional responses are disproportionate will continue to second-guess their emotional responses in their next relationship, their next workplace, their next friendship. The damage is structural. It requires active, deliberate work to undo, not simply the removal of the person who caused it. This is something that Patricia Henley, the social worker from Manchester who reviewed Carol Gregory's case alongside those 14 others, documented in her follow-up interviews conducted between 1991 and 1993. The women she tracked had left or been removed from the relationships in which the manipulation occurred. They were, by external measures, safe, and yet an average of 4 years after separation, the majority of them still reported habitual self-doubt in everyday situations. They still questioned their memories of conversations. They still felt a reflexive need to verify their perceptions against external sources before acting on them. They still carried the voice. Henley described this in her 1994 report as cognitive residue, the persistent effect of sustained manipulation on the target's relationship with their own cognition. It is a phrase that does not appear in any clinical diagnostic manual, but it describes something real, something documented, and something that the people who carry it experience as a fundamental feature of their interior life. Now let's talk about what this looks like, specifically, so that you can identify it. The first signal is what researchers call reality-checking loops. These are moments in which you find yourself replaying the conversation, an event, an exchange, not to understand it better, but to try to establish whether it actually occurred in the way you experienced it. This is distinct from ordinary reflection. Ordinary reflection asks, "What did that mean?" or "How should I respond?" Reality-checking loops ask, "Did that really happen?" and "Am I sure I understood that correctly?" If you find yourself regularly doing this, and particularly if you find yourself doing it in relation to one specific person or context, that is a signal worth attending to. The second signal is the apology pattern. People in gaslighting dynamics apologize frequently, disproportionately, and for things they cannot fully articulate. They apologize in advance. They apologize for having feelings. They apologize for asking questions. They apologize for needing clarification. If you notice that in a particular relationship or context, you apologize more than in any other relationship or context, and particularly if you often apologize without a clear sense of what you are apologizing for, that is a signal. The third signal is what clinical psychologist Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively on gaslighting in both therapeutic and legal contexts, calls emotional arithmetic. This is the internal process of calculating whether your emotional response is proportionate before allowing yourself to have it. Am I overreacting? Is this really worth feeling this way about? They would say, I'm being too sensitive. If you are consistently performing this calculation before allowing your emotional responses to surface, if you are editing yourself before you have even fully experienced what you are feeling, that is a signal that someone has installed doubt about your emotional perceptions at a deep enough level that you have taken over the installation process yourself. The fourth signal is the exhaustion of advocacy. People who are being gaslit over a sustained period reach a point at which they simply stop advocating for their version of reality. It is not that they stop believing it. It is that the cost of defending it the energy required to maintain a position against someone who will never, under any circumstances, acknowledge that your perception might be valid, becomes prohibitive. They disengage, they capitulate. They agree that yes, perhaps they are misremembering, perhaps they are overreacting, perhaps they need to work on their communication. This is not resolution. This is exhaustion, dressed up as resolution. And it is observable from the outside as a person who increasingly does not speak up for themselves, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that saying it incurs costs that they can no longer absorb. The fifth signal is the isolation pattern, gaslighting. Particularly in its sustained, deliberate forms, almost always involves the progressive narrowing of the target's access to external reality checking. This can be physical isolation from friends and family. More commonly, it is social isolation, the systematic undermining of the target's trust in the people who might otherwise provide a contrasting perspective. Your friends don't really understand your situation. Your mother has always been biased against me. That therapist is making things worse. Each statement individually might be true or might be offered with genuine concern. The pattern. The consistent movement toward a position where the gaslighter is the primary or sole source of reality interpretation is the signal. There is something important to say here about the difference between recognizing these signals in your own life and using this framework as a weapon against others. The popular use of the word gaslighting has created a version of the concept that is applied reflexively in conflict to mean you disagree with me or you are not validating my experience. That is not what this is. The pattern described here involves specific, sustained, observable behaviors. It involves a consistent effort to undermine someone's relationship with their own perception. It involves the deployment of doubt as a control mechanism. A single disagreement, a single instance of someone presenting a different recollection, a single moment of conflict in which someone does not accept your account. None of those are this. The pattern is the thing. The direction is the thing. The progressive, systematic movement toward a position where your perception is always the variable that cannot be trusted, that is the thing. But here is the question that the research presses toward, and that most popular treatments of this subject decline to ask: what do you do when you recognize it? The first and most important thing is to establish an external record, not as evidence for a legal proceeding, though that may ultimately be relevant. As a stabilizing tool for your own cognition. When you have a significant conversation, write down what you remember of it. What was said, what was not said, what was decided. Not as an act of suspicion, not as preparation for a confrontation, but as an act of self-preservation. Because the reality-checking loops described earlier, those cycles in which you replay events trying to establish whether they occurred, can be interrupted by documentation. When you have written, in your own words at the time, what happened, you have an anchor. The doubt that is installed later has something to push against. The second thing is to identify at least one person outside the relationship who has full access to your experience of it. Not someone who will simply take your side. That is not what you need. Someone who will listen to your account and respond honestly to it. Someone whose response you can use as one data point among several in your own assessment of your situation. The isolation that gaslighting depends on is interrupted by this. The gaslighter's version of reality only goes unchallenged when you have no one to check it against. The third thing is to pay attention to the pattern, not the incident. Any single incident can be explained. You did misremember. You were upset. The conversation did go differently than you recall. The pattern is what cannot be explained away. If over a series of months you are consistently wrong in your recollections, consistently inappropriate in your emotional responses, consistently too sensitive or too reactive or too suspicious, sometimes not in specific contexts, but as a defining feature of who you apparently are in this relationship alone, the pattern is telling you something that the incident cannot. The fourth thing, and this is the one that research on recovery from coercive control identifies as most critical, is to distinguish between self-reflection and self-doubt. Self-reflection is asking, is it possible I contributed to this in some way? Self-doubt is asking, is it possible that I am constitutionally incapable of perceiving situations accurately? The first is healthy. The second is the installed product of sustained manipulation. The question is whether you would apply the same doubt to anyone else in the same situation. If someone described to you from the outside the exact situation you are in, would you conclude that the problem was their fundamental inability to perceive reality, or would you take their account seriously? Apply to yourself what you would apply to someone you cared about. That is not a formula for credulity. It is a formula for equity. The final thing, and it is not a step in any process, it is simply true, is that the damage done by this pattern does not make you broken. It makes you someone who was subjected to a sophisticated, sustained attack on one of the most fundamental human capacities, the capacity to trust your own experience of the world. The researchers who have studied this, from Judith Herman to Evan Starr to Jennifer Freyd to Robin Stern, are unanimous on this. The response of a person who has been through this is not a disorder. It is a rational adaptation to an irrational environment. The self-doubt that you carry is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of having been in a situation that weaponized your basic human need for relational coherence. Carol Gregory, the woman who walked into that Manchester police station in 1985, eventually left her marriage. The social worker who reviewed her case, Patricia Henley, stayed in contact with her for years afterward. In her 1994 report, Henley included a brief account from Gregory herself, given 6 years after separation. Gregory described the process of rebuilding her relationship with her own perception as the most difficult thing she had ever done, harder than leaving, harder than the practical logistics of rebuilding a life. She described moments in her daily life, a conversation with a colleague, a minor disagreement with a neighbor, in which she would still feel the pull of the old reflex, the reflexive move toward, perhaps I got that wrong. She described it as a habit of mind so deep that she was not sure it would ever fully leave. But she also described something else. She described the specific moment in which she had been sitting in Henley's office, and Henley had shown her the files, shown her the documented consistent parallel pattern across all 15 women, shown her that what she had experienced had a structure, that the structure was recognizable, that it had been designed. She said that seeing that it was a pattern, that it had a name, that it had been studied, had given her something back that she did not have a word for. It was not validation in the emotional sense. It was closer to the sensation of returning to a room you knew was real but had been told was imaginary. The room was real. It always was. The pattern we have traced today, from Hamilton's 1938 play to Morgan's congressional-level case to the neuroimaging work at the Max Planck Institute, is one of the most documented and least understood mechanisms of psychological control. It is happening right now in homes and workplaces and families that look entirely ordinary from the outside. It is happening to people who are intelligent and observant, and who have, for that very reason, become particularly susceptible to having their intelligence and observance turned against them. You now know what to look for: the reality-checking loops, the exhaustion of advocacy, the apology pattern, the emotional arithmetic, the progressive isolation from external reality-checking. You know how the pattern begins with a single, deniable incident. You know how it escalates towards systematic self-doubt. You know how the internal voice of the gaslighter gets installed and operates independently. And you know that recovery, the rebuilding of trust in your own perception, is not only possible but documented. In real people, in real clinical settings, across real spans of time. None of this is entertainment. All of this is usable. The moment you recognize the structure loses some of its power. Not all of it. The work is longer than recognition. But recognition is where it starts. The question that matters now is this. Looking at the relationships in your life, not the dramatic ones, not the obviously difficult ones, but the ordinary, everyday ones, is there anyone in whose presence you consistently trust yourself less?